coming up a little bit later.
In 2013, convicted killer Ian McLaughlin stabbed a man to death while on day release from prison.
The case prompted the government to tighten rules on the temporary release of inmates, but now the restrictions are being changed so prisoners can spend a day doing paid work or looking after their children.
We can talk now to Helen Berresford from the social justice charity Nacro. Thank you very much for talking to us this morning. So Helen, what will this look like when people hear there will be more prisoners released on day release or overnight? What will that look like in this country?
Well, firstly, just to say that at Nacro, we support efforts to increase the use of day release for people who are in prison, because it can make a real difference to somebody's resettlement back into the community and ultimately reducing reoffending. What we hope is that this is the government sending a clear message that actually in future that day release becomes a much more embedded part of release planning across the prison estate. What we know from the evidence is that day release can actually, people who go out on day release into work placements are less likely to reoffend when they are released from prison. So really we're looking at how we reduce the high and stubborn rates of reoffending in this country.
When we introduced this interview, we mentioned Ian McLaughlin, who was jailed for life in 2013 after murdering someone on day release. These are the stories that stick in people's minds. How can the concern about something like that happening again be put aside or soothed?
No, that's right. And obviously the example that you showed is a real tragedy, and what we need to do is make sure that all cases are risk assessed, and that is part of what happens at the minute and will happen in the future. But this really is about how we look at in the future preventing future victims of crime by reducing reoffending. We know that having a job, having somewhere to live, having family ties are all really important parts of reducing reoffending when somebody comes out of prison, and day release plays a really big part in that, starting to get somebody used to what it's like being back in the community again. And I think we shouldn't underestimate how difficult the transition between prison and the community can be for some people. I know that I was talking to somebody recently that Nacro support on release from prison, who was saying how difficult and how stressful he found that period in the run-up to the release from prison, and that actually these kind of things can really start to make that more easy and actually ease the transition, so that when they come out things are set up and therefore they're less likely to reoffend in the future. So
let's look at the kind of checklist, I suppose, that is gone through for someone to be allowed to be released on day release. You mentioned family ties, you mentioned there needs to be the prospect of a job. What does that list look like, and who is most likely to, what kind of people are we most likely to see released?
Well, at the minute, the people who are more likely to go out on day release are people in open prisons or women's prisons, so who have already been assessed as being very low risk to the public. And that actually what that looks like in terms of the day is that they will then have a risk assessment in place, and it might include them going out into a workplace, and they'll be learning skills whilst they're in prison, doing training while they're in prison, but actually will then spend a day perhaps of a week in a workplace to put those skills into practice in a normal workplace. It might also include, in the short term ahead of release from prison, going out and starting to spend time with family again. Obviously, a long period away from family in prison can make those family relationships quite difficult, and this is about trying to build those back up again so that the release from prison doesn't come as so much of a shock, and then actually all of those things can be sustained to give people the best chance of resettling back into the community and reducing reoffending.
Helen, thank you very much. Helen Berresford talking to us there from the charity Nacro. Thank you.
Thank you.
Time now.